It was the sort of morning Oxford does better than most cities, though I dare say few notice. The fog had the colour of old milk and moved through the quad like something uncertain of its welcome. You might have walked past a friend without knowing, if either of you were the sort to walk anywhere before 9. I wasn't. But I remember that morning with the clarity one reserves for missteps, both moral and procedural. I had taken breakfast alone, a quiet ritual, made quieter by the absence of newspaper delivery, no crossword to anchor the tea. I was left with marmalade and thoughts I would rather have postponed. Strange had rung the evening before. Something about a missing fellow at All Saints, Bursar no less. And could I be persuaded? I had replied with the kind of grunt that passes for consent when made over the rim of a whiskey glass. I didn't arrive at the college until just before 10. The porter, a boyish man with unfortunate ambition in his moustache, greeted me with the kind of half-respect given to a policeman in tweed. Said they'd found the Bursar's bicycle near the chapel gate, in a spot no one would have left it who didn't want it noticed. A classic rally, I think. The sort with a brass bell and leather saddle that no undergrad would dare pinch out of misplaced reverence. The bike had been wheeled back to the porter's lodge by then, but not before the early chapel crowd had seen it. I paused by the bike. There was something about it. Not its presence, but its placement. The back tire was damp from the grass, yet the frame had no dew. The handlebar grips had the imprint of recent use, but no one had seen him ride in. I asked if anyone had checked his rooms. We climbed the stairs to the Bursar's apartment. The corridor smelt of furniture polish and loneliness, the sort of corridor where footsteps feel like offences. The door was ajar, not open, just parted like an unspoken sentence. The porter hesitated, then looked to me. I pushed it with a knuckle. A door should never creak in Oxford. It's a failure of both maintenance and metaphor. But this one did. Inside was order, not the obsessive sort that smothers, but the gentler kind, cultivated like a neglected garden left to grow into symmetry. A desk with papers laid in predictable diagonals. A teacup turned upside down on its saucer. A bookshelf lined not alphabetically, but emotionally, as if the Bursar had placed volumes according to their capacity for sorrow. On the desk was a letter, unsealed, addressed to someone with the initials E.R. I didn't read it then. I'm not one to rifle through private things unless prompted. But I did notice, beside the blotter, a crossword torn from the Times and filled in half-heartedly. The final clue is unanswered. 5 across, consequence of concealment. 8 letters. I made a mental note to return to that later. There was no sign of struggle, though the ash in the tray beside the armchair suggested a pipe had been smoked far past comfort. I walked through to the bedroom. Bed made, curtains half drawn, a pair of slippers arranged too precisely for someone in a hurry. And yet the bicycle. It was the bicycle that troubled me. We left the rooms untouched. I told the porter to notify the college head, the warden they call them here, as if guarding secrets instead of budgets. Then I walked slowly back through the quad, where the fog had begun to lift. A bird? A blackbird, I think, hopped across the flagstones in front of me, pausing once to look up, as if considering a question it wouldn't bother to ask. I stood in the middle of the quadrangle, listening to the silence that follows routine disturbance. Somewhere behind a stained glass window, an organ began its warm-up scale, haltingly, like a confession held back. I lit a cigarette I hadn't meant to smoke and watched its curl rise into the thinning air. It would be days before the body surfaced, weeks before the motives unraveled. But in that moment, with the fog still in retreat and the scent of polish and pipe smoke lingering faintly in my coat, I knew something had already ended. And something else had just begun. It was not unusual for someone to miss a meeting. Even Oxford, for all its clocks and customs, allowed for lateness. But there was a difference between being late and being absent in a way that left no trace, no apology, no breath, no echo. Leonard Stratham was not a man inclined to vanish, and yet that is precisely what he did. By mid-morning the whispers had gathered shape. A junior fellow, too eager, too apologetic, had knocked on the bursar's door at 9:30. No answer. At 10, the warden grew visibly irritated, which for men in robes is the equivalent of shouting. At 11, I was summoned from a quiet pew in St. Michael's, where I had wandered in to consider nothing in particular. The request arrived not with sirens, but with the dry urgency of an academic whisper passed hand to hand. Strange had asked for discretion, which I found both flattering and unnecessary. The college didn't want a scene. They wanted someone who would look carefully without making others uncomfortable. I suppose I was well suited to that kind of discomfort. The porter led me back through the quad. The fog had thinned, but its memory still clung to the corners. He spoke as we walked, a murmur rather than a report. Said the bursar had been expected at the finance committee meeting, that he had never missed one before, that his desk calendar still bore yesterday's date and a penciled note. Evensong, chapel, 6:15. I stood for a moment outside the office door, that same door I'd entered earlier, noting now the faint chip in the varnish near the lock, a detail I hadn't registered the first time. Inside, the room was untouched. No papers disturbed, no sign of packing or urgency. A single curtain drawn, the other not. The letter to ER remained on the agent desk, its envelope still unsealed. The junior fellow appeared again, hair damp from worry, and mentioned, as if reluctant to do so, that a student had heard raised voices in the bursar's rooms the night before. Around 7, perhaps later. Not a fight exactly, but the kind of exchange that suggests old history. Not volume, but gravity. I asked who the voices might have belonged to. The student hadn't recognized them, but thought one of them quoted something, a line from a poem or perhaps scripture. Oxford is full of quotations, most of them misremembered. I spent the afternoon in quiet movement, not interrogation, just presence. A glance into the chapel where the choir rehearsed. A pause in the senior common room where conversation always halts just after you enter and resumes 2 seconds after you leave. I drank tea in the library under the pretense of warming my hands, but really to observe. And there, across the hall, I saw her. She sat at a small table near the window. Evangeline Rose, college librarian. Her name, like her presence, carried an odd gravity, romantic without warmth, exacting without threat. She wore a grey cardigan and spectacles that gave nothing away. She was marking a page in a rare volume, her finger lingering not on the words, but on the space between them. I asked, later, if she had spoken with Stratham recently. Her eyes flickered. Not surprised, not frightened, but inward. She said they'd taken tea 2 days ago. He had seemed distracted, had mentioned something about errors in the archives. Not numbers, poetry. Errors in poetry. I thought of the crossword again. Consequence of concealment. 8 letters. I had tried confinement and reversal. Neither fit. The empty square still hovered in my mind. The warden, when I saw him, was diplomatic to a fault. He offered concern, a gesture of openness, and nothing else. Said Stratham was a private man, not given to drama, that perhaps he had gone to London unexpectedly, some bursarial emergency. But even as he said it, I saw the lie rest gently in the crease between his brows. He didn't believe it either. I left the college late, the fog having lifted entirely now. The air had sharpened, grown honest. A thin rain began to fall, the kind that doesn't trouble you until you stop walking. I reached into my coat pocket for the letter I hadn't read and withdrew my hand instead. Some things, I found, prefer to wait. I walked past the bicycle once more, which had now moved into storage. Its chain was dry, no mud on the tires, a curious absence of the journey it had supposedly taken. Like its rider, it had arrived without arriving at all. Stratham's rooms had the silence of someone who disliked silence. You could feel the absence of something, not just of the man himself, but of whatever filled his hours. I stood once more in the study, the smell of stale pipe smoke still faint in the air, and noticed it then. No music. No wireless. No record sleeve left half-shelved in distraction. Just a polished cabinet that looked like it ought to hold LPS but didn't. The space where the turntable might have sat was instead occupied by a stack of marked invoices arranged with clerical dignity. There was something indecent about it. Not the quiet, but the way it had been achieved. Not chosen, but enforced. I ran a hand along the edge of the desk, not to discover anything, but because sometimes the grain of oak offers more truth than conversation. The crossword was still there, naturally. I couldn't leave it. Consequence of concealment. 8 letters. Not grief. Not silence. Not regret. A word just beyond the edges of certainty. The ashtray was clean save for a single flake of tobacco, curled like a leaf before rain. I studied it too long, knowing it wouldn't speak. Then my eyes moved to the bookcase, tall, worn, and loaded with precision. No dust. Spines aligned with the clock's neurosis. And yet one book, near the top left, had been reshelved upside down. It was a volume of collected Bach cantatas, cloth-bound, gold-lettered, the kind of edition you only purchase if you plan to live with it. I pulled it down carefully, and something fell from between the pages. A photograph. 3 men seated on a bench beside the Isis. The sort of faded color print you get from a Boots camera, where time softens the eyes and overexposes the sky. Stratham, unmistakably younger. Railsey, I thought, though with more hair and less disappointment. The third man I did not know. Sharp-featured, smiling, his hand on Stratham's shoulder. I turned it over. No date, just an inscription in faint pencil. We'll forget nothing, not even this. That sort of sentiment never bodes well. Lewis arrived then, out of breath as always, and said they'd had no luck tracing the Bursar's movements after evensong. No taxi, no sign at the station, no hospital admissions, the sort of vanishing that leaves records untouched. He asked if I'd found anything, and I told him not yet. Which was true, if you think of finding as possession. I'd seen something. I hadn't caught it. He looked at the pipe rack and made a remark about how people our age shouldn't smoke. I let it pass. Age is a difficult subject, and Lewis treats it as a railway timetable. Always ahead, never missed. After he left, I sat in the chair by the window. The angle offered a view of the quad. Students walking with books pressed to their chests like fragile inheritances. I noticed then a detail that hadn't struck me earlier. The top of the window had been wedged slightly open with an old pencil, sharpened at both ends. A childish trick, or deliberate. Why open the window at all on a cold October night? The room had been otherwise shut. The curtains partially drawn, the door left just ajar. It felt like a paradox, an invitation and a withdrawal in the same breath. I stood again, checked the drawer of the sideboard. Receipts, term bills, and budget drafts, all methodical. Except one, labelled Michaelmas 1974, had a torn corner and bore a faint smudge of ink across the total. It had been handled recently, with care that wasn't quite careful enough. There are 2 kinds of disappearance. The kind people orchestrate for themselves, and the kind someone prepares for them. The bicycle, clean, yet left to be seen. The pipe, used, but only once. The room, silent, but with a book misfiled and a window pried open. Nothing was broken, but everything was slightly, intentionally, off. I left the room for the second time that day with more questions than I'd entered, which, as it happens, is the only honest way to leave a room. And still, the absence of music lingered, not just unheard, but missing, as if Stratham had packed it away somewhere no one else could reach. Her name suited her too well to be unremarked. Evangeline Rose. It was the kind of name one remembered after a single introduction, not because it announced itself loudly, but because it didn't. It lingered gently in the margins. Like a postscript you almost miss, then realize you shouldn't have. I first saw her properly in the senior library, where she moved with the sort of quiet that belongs to people who've always been slightly elsewhere. She wasn't shelving books so much as conversing with them, the way her fingers traced the spines, the pause before sliding a volume back into place, as though she were considering whether it deserved to return to the darkness. She didn't look up when I approached, but I knew she'd heard me. There are silences that feel personal. That one did. I asked if she had spoken to Mr. Stratham recently. She closed the book she hadn't been reading, a volume of George Herbert's poetry bound in wine-red leather, and said that they took tea most Thursdays. She looked at me then, not as if studying me, but as if placing me. I told her I'd seen her name mentioned in his appointment diary, next to a penciled ER. She smiled faintly. Said it stood for evening reading, a joke between them. Not a very good one. I asked if she'd seen him the evening before last. She nodded. He was late and distracted. He spoke of the chapel evensong and some error in the archives. Nothing serious, he said. Just a matter of provenance. I asked what kind. She shrugged. A poem, perhaps. A line that didn't quite belong to the person who had claimed it. There was a carefulness in the way she chose her words, as though she were mentally circling them first. She said Stratham had grown increasingly uneasy over the past month, not outwardly, but in the way he touched things. Rested his hand on a paper longer than needed. Paused at the threshold of a room before entering. I asked if she thought he'd been frightened. She said no, but perhaps compromised. I asked about their history. She gave a low sort of laugh, the kind that lives closer to the throat than the chest, and said once, long ago, they had been fond of each other, that Oxford was full of such fondnesses, unfinished and carefully filed away. She walked with me to the archway, our footsteps slowed by the ancient stone beneath. She gestured towards the Bursar's rooms, said she hadn't been inside them in years. He had always insisted on meeting elsewhere. She said it gently, but there was something behind it. I asked if they had argued. She said nothing for a moment, then replied that Stratham wasn't the arguing type, that he withdrew instead, that he knew things, too many things, and sometimes that knowledge made him unkind without realizing. The wind caught her coat as we stopped beneath the cloister. She looked across the quad toward the chapel and said that evensong had ended in silence that night. The final chord of the canticle is unresolved, a mistake, or not. She asked if I had ever noticed how people vanish in Oxford long before they leave, that they disappear in stages, first from conversation, then from expectation, and finally from memory. She said Stratham had been vanishing for a while. She had only just noticed. I didn't ask her more. I thanked her. And as I turned, she said one last thing. That if I found a copy of Elegy on a college bench, the attribution in the catalogue was wrong. It wasn't written by the person it claimed. And that Stratham had always cared too much about such things. Later, in his room, I found the poem, folded neatly between 2 pages of a ledger. 8 lines, unsigned. 1 line stood out. The names we bury live longer than the ones we speak. It wasn't much of a poem, but it had the ring of a truth too long in hiding. I looked again at the unfinished crossword. Consequence of concealment. 8 letters. Not silence. Not omission. Maybe. Forgetting. It had been resting quietly in the drawer beneath a sheaf of music program leaflets and a half-filled term expense log. The envelope was unsealed, but addressed with deliberate hand, ER. I had seen it before, of course, left it untouched on first inspection, as one often does with things that feel too intimate for daylight. But something about the light that afternoon, the way it fell, sideways and uncertain, through the stained windows of the college, made me sit down and read it at last. It wasn't long. Letters rarely are when they're honest. 3 sentences. No date, no formal greeting. I know what you did. I've waited long enough. If I'm not at the chapel tonight, you'll understand why. No signature. None needed. The paper was Stratham's, college embossed, the kind they issue for bursarial notices and invitations to minor annual feasts. But the ink had blotted faintly in the middle, as though the pen had paused too long or the hand had trembled. I folded it once, gently, and placed it back where I found it. There are accusations that do not require witnesses. Lewis appeared not long after. He carried the day's report with the enthusiasm of a boy bringing bad news wrapped in tin foil. Still no sighting of Stratham, no bank activity, no calls to family. Though, it turns out, he had none. A distant cousin in Cheltenham who hadn't seen him in 15 years. I asked about the archives. Anything missing? Lewis said not obviously, though one of the graduate assistants had mentioned a gap in the library's poetry catalogue. An old piece, misfiled, possibly reattributed. Possibly not. That word again, possibly. Oxford had always made room for ambiguity. It was, after all, how the institution survived. I returned to the library on foot. The drizzle had stopped, but the paths were still damp, and I found myself stepping more carefully than usual, as if the stones themselves might remember. Miss Rose wasn't at her desk, but her absence somehow felt curated. Her chair pushed in, a small note on the desk, not addressed to anyone, just gone to chapel. Back before Vespers. On instinct, I turned left toward the restricted stacks. The heavy door creaked the way wood only creaks when books are watching. I walked the aisle slowly, fingertips brushing spines. Philosophy, ancient history, music, poetry. It was there I saw it. A thin space where no space should have been. A book missing, not recently, but meaningfully. The gap had been filled by two thicker tomes pressed together, an unnatural pairing, Spencer and Sidney, shouldering one another uncomfortably. I pulled them aside and peered into the narrow hollow behind. Dust, mostly, but also a slip of card, archival stock, cream-edged, and a scribble of writing I recognized at once as Stratham's. Elegy on a college bench, anonymous, possibly dense, unpublished. One copy. The handwriting faltered on dense. Not crossed out, not underlined. Just hesitant, as if naming him might undo something. I pocketed the card, returned the books, and stepped back into the corridor, which seemed longer than before. A cleaner passed me, humming something tuneless and slow. I thought of the photograph again. The three men on the bench by the Isis, and how only two names had so far surfaced. Back in my flat, I poured a whiskey without ceremony and sat by the crossword. Still unfinished. Consequence of concealment. 8 letters. I tried omission again, knowing it didn't fit. Then withheld. Still wrong. I took out the letter from my coat pocket. Not the one addressed to ER, but the one I'd received from Strange earlier in the week. Something about the budget. Something I hadn't opened. I unfolded it now, more from habit than interest, and found a single sheet of college stationery with a note scribbled at the bottom. Morse, this one's for you. Quietly, please. We owe them that much. Quietly. The word repeated in my mind as I looked once more at the letter that hadn't been sent. Stratham had written it, addressed it, and then done nothing. A gesture, not an action. A warning to be read after he had vanished. It struck me then. Not what was said, but what wasn't. He hadn't named the deed. He hadn't accused. Just 3 sentences. Like footsteps on wet stone, fading, but not yet gone. The photograph hadn't moved. I'd left it lying beside the crossword, meaning to file it later. But there it remained. Thin, curling faintly at the corners, the colors already beginning to retreat towards sepia. 3 men on a bench, their knees almost touching, framed by the indifferent waters of the Isis. I recognized 2, as before, Leonard Stratham and Edwin Railsey. The third remained unnamed, though his face, high-cheeked, austere, had grown familiar in my mind. He looked not at the camera, but just past it, as though the truth of the scene lay somewhere else. His left hand rested lightly on Stratham's shoulder, the gesture neither possessive nor performative, just known. I turned the photograph again, the penciled line on the back. "We'll forget nothing, not even this." A line so sentimental it almost disguised its threat. Lewis had, to his credit, taken the clue seriously. He'd spent the morning knee-deep in the college archives, bribing the deputy registrar with black coffee and awkward silences. When he returned, the rain had followed him in, clinging to the wool of his coat, gathering in droplets on his nose. He looked mildly victorious. There was a name, Arthur Dents. Former tutor in classical literature, matriculated in 1968, appointed junior fellow 3 years later, resigned abruptly in 1976. No scandal recorded, just a line in the college minutes, Dr. Dents to vacate rooms by the end of the term. No replacement at this time. I'd seen more damning phrases scratched in crossword margins. Lewis had found a current address, a cottage near Burford, half an hour by car if the weather behaved. It didn't. We arrived under skies the colour of pewter, the wind pressing the hedgerows flat as we turned into the narrow lane. The house was modest, flint-walled, with ivy clinging to its edges like gossip that refused to die. Dents opened the door with a kind of weary resignation, the look of a man who had heard footsteps too many times and never liked what followed. He remembered Stratham. That was clear, but said little at first, just that they'd known each other in the way people do when proximity is mistaken for friendship. I asked about the photograph. He didn't look at it, just said he hadn't seen it in years, though his voice suggested otherwise. I asked why he left the college. He poured tea before answering, the kind of tea that cools fast in thin porcelain. Said academia is full of small betrayals. That a paper of his, unpublished, unremarkable, but personally significant, had been quoted once too publicly by someone else. Railsey, presumably, though he didn't name him. I asked if Stratham had known. He said yes, that Leonard had advised him to let it go. The college would never favour confrontation over reputation. He looked out the window then, a field of wet grass stretched beyond the garden as empty as his tone. Said he supposed he'd been waiting for someone to ask him these questions, and that now, being asked, he found he didn't care much about the answers. I noticed a small painting on the mantel, 3 rowing men on the river. Crude watercolour, barely shaded. But one of the rowers wore a red scarf, just like the one in the photograph. I asked about it. He said it had been a gift. Stratham's mother, perhaps. Or not. We left without pushing harder. There was nothing he'd admit to, and no reason to make him lie. Back in Oxford, I stared again at the photo. Railsey had the same look then as now, amused by something no one else understood. I recalled, faintly, that he'd once been tipped for a professorship but never got it. Too flamboyant, someone had said. Too clever by half. I studied the placement of their hands, their eyes, their distance from one another. People pose in ways they can't control. I saw, finally, what I'd missed before. Only Stratham was touching both men. The bridge between them, the one who stayed. I picked up the crossword, wrote down the clue again. Consequence of concealment. 8 letters. Still no answer. Only a photograph, and the silence it refused to share. It was the kind of mistake you don't notice unless you're waiting for it. A line delivered too cleanly, too confidently, and yet wrong in a way that lingers. I was sitting at the back of the chapel, as I often do when clarity proves evasive. Not for any spiritual nourishment. God and I had long since reached an agreement. But because evensong has its own logic, patterns, cadence, a place where thought can move without needing to arrive. The choir had just finished the Magnificat, their voices thinning like breath on glass, when the chaplain rose and offered a reading. Herbert, of course. Always Herbert in October, a safe kind of depth. But then the line came, "Teach me, my God and King, in all things thee to see." It wasn't wrong, not entirely. But the rhythm had shifted. The emphasis falls oddly, like a footprint in the wrong soil. I closed my eyes. The correct line in Herbert's original, "Teach me, my God and King, in all things thee to find." The difference was small, but it wasn't anything. See is passive. Find requires motion. After the service, I spoke to the chaplain. He said the booklet had been typeset by the bursar's office. Stratham, meticulous as he was, had insisted on verifying every quotation personally. I asked if anyone else had access to the proof sheets. He said yes. The bursar's secretary and the librarian, Miss Rose, for the final printing order. The bells began to ring as I walked back through the cloister. Evening bells, thin, metallic, uncertain. I thought of the red-scarfed man in the photograph, Arthur Dent's, forgotten but not erased, and wondered who had wanted to correct a poet, and why. Lewis met me at the gates. He had a folder under one arm, coffee in the other, and that peculiar mixture of irritation and pride that meant he had found something I'd overlooked. He told me the bursar's old term reports had finally been delivered from storage. He'd found annotations, not just numbers, but marginalia. Stratham had scribbled lines from poems into the margins of budget notes, half a stanza beside a heating bill, a couplet tucked under an accommodation report. One of them read, "The soul's dark cottage, battered and decayed, lets in new light through chinks that time hath made." I remembered that line. Edmund Waller, not Herbert, but the same tone, the same fear. Back in the Bursar's rooms, still sealed, still motionless, I opened the second drawer of the desk, the one I hadn't checked before. Inside was a folder marked Fellowship Appointments, 1975. I recognized the date, the year Dent's resigned, and inside, tucked between printed forms and meeting minutes, was a letter of recommendation for Railsea. Stratham's signature, clipped and clear. But there, in the margins, a single penciled word, reluctantly. Not underlined, not circled, just resting there, like an apology that never found a recipient. And beneath the folder, folded once but creased as if read many times, was the chapel reading proof. The misquoted line is marked in red. Not Herbert's original, not the modern revision. A hybrid, a careful misremembering. I returned to the chapel before midnight. The lights were out, save for the flicker of the votive candles. I sat again at the back, thought of Stratham sitting in the same pew, marking a misquotation in ink, watching a choir sing words he knew too well to believe. A man doesn't alter a poet for error. He does it for meaning. See rather than find. Perhaps he no longer believed in the search. I looked again at the photograph, which I'd carried with me in the inner pocket of my coat. 3 men. 2 named. 1 erased. And in that silence, I remembered something Miss Rose had said, that Stratham had once corrected a donor plaque for a misplaced comma, not out of pedantry, but because, as he put it, even the smallest error opens the door to doubt. Somewhere between evensong and the margin of a ledger, doubt had found him, and stayed. There is a kind of silence found only in college gardens after dark. It isn't the absence of noise, not entirely. The wind still finds the laurel, the leaves still mutter, but rather the hush of something withheld. A breath not taken, a path not chosen. I returned to All Saints just past 10. The quad was empty, lit in fragments by the gas lamps that always seemed too dim to serve but too old to replace. I had no reason to be there, not formally, but I had been thinking all evening of that misquoted line in chapel and how it refused to settle, and of the letter that hadn't been sent, and of Dent's hands, twitching slightly, when I'd mentioned the year 1975, as though a thread had been pulled somewhere deep. The porter was off duty, replaced by a younger man who didn't know how to ask questions. I nodded once and kept walking. past the buttery, past the north cloister, toward the old garden where no one goes unless they have something they need to forget. The gate was ajar, not wide, just open enough to suggest recent use. It swung a little on its hinges, moving as if uncertain, though there was no wind. I stood there for a moment. The moon had just cleared the chapel spire, and in its light, the garden looked more sculpted than real. The hedges were pruned too neatly, the gravel too precise. Only the bench beneath the copper beech bore signs of life. A slight depression in the cushion, faint traces of crushed leaves on the seat. Someone had been here. Not hours ago. Minutes. I stepped through and closed the gate gently behind me, listening to the click of the latch. There's something oddly final about that sound. Not a lock, exactly, but a quiet insistence. Something has ended here. I walked the garden twice. On the second pass, I saw it, just beneath the bench, a cigarette butt, still faintly warm when I touched it. Turkish blend, not a student's choice. Railsy, I thought, or possibly the chaplain. But neither seemed the type to smoke in solitude. I sat. The bench was damp, but I stayed. The air had that peculiar edge that arrives just before rain. Above me, the beach rustled, not like leaves stirred by wind, but like fabric being drawn slowly across a polished table. When I returned to the porter's lodge, I asked whether anyone had passed through in the last hour. The young man hesitated. Said yes. Dr. Railsey, not long ago. No coat. Looked agitated. Said he needed air. I didn't ask why no one had told me sooner. The question would have embarrassed us both. Instead, I went to the senior common room. It was near midnight, but the lights were still on. Inside, Railsey sat alone at the window, a tumbler of sherry untouched at his elbow. He didn't look up when I entered. He said something about the cold creeping in early this year, then asked, too casually, whether I'd had any news. I told him I hadn't. Not officially. He nodded once, then turned his gaze back to the window. We talked, or rather circled the idea of conversation, for nearly 10 minutes. He asked whether I liked Herbert. I said I preferred Larkin. He said that was predictable. I said most things are. Then, as I rose to leave, he asked whether I thought mistakes were ever truly past. I paused. Said that some aren't mistakes at the time, only in retrospect. He didn't respond. Just lifted his glass, let it hover in the air for a moment, then set it down untouched. On my way out, I passed through the quad again. The garden gate had been latched now, but not by me. Back in my rooms, I looked again at the crossword. Consequence of concealment. 8 letters. I wrote one more. Possibility. Remainder. It didn't fit, but it stayed on the page longer than the others had. Some doors close with certainty. Others remain, like the garden gate, just slightly, intentionally, ajar. Some numbers are too tidy to trust. I've learned that over the years, not from forensic accountancy, which I detest, but from watching the kind of men who believe neatness can outpace guilt. Guilt, I've found, tends to seep, but neatness dries too quickly. It was Lewis, of course, who brought me the ledger. He always looks apologetic when he hands me something dull, as though afraid I'll disown him for presenting facts without poetry. But I took it from him, and I told him nothing more than that I'd read it carefully. Which was a lie. I intended to skim. But then I saw it. A small reconciliation report tucked into the last pages. Dated in Stratham's final term, the columns added up too well, not just accurate. Mathematically beautiful. That kind of symmetry has no place in bursarial logic. Real ledgers possess the same imperfections as real lives. Someone always forgets to file a form, round down a decimal, or submit a receipt. But this entry, a fellowship disbursement, had not a trace of that. The name caught me too, a scholarship awarded to a former student, D.A. Linscomb, for postgraduate research in 1975, and then again, the same amount, issued just last quarter, as a discretionary alumni grant. Linscomb. The name wasn't in any of the college's more recent rolls. I checked twice. I asked Lewis to run the alumni list. Nothing. No forwarding address. No thesis recorded. No email. No Linscomb. Which meant either the man had disappeared more thoroughly than any graduate has a right to, or someone had made him up. I returned to Stratham's rooms that evening, carrying the ledger like a guilty thing. I sat at his desk, the smell of the room still holding its faint blend of tobacco and furniture polish. The photograph was still there, beneath the blotter. I looked at the faces again. Stratham, solemn. Railsey, amused. Dense, unreadable. I turned the ledger slowly, not looking for content anymore, looking for rhythm, the way the pen moved, the difference between confident strokes and those that hesitate. The scholarship entries, both 1975 and the recent echo, were written in Stratham's hand. But the signature line bore an addition, a second pen, a line initialed E.R. Evangeline Rose. The librarian. But that didn't fit. Not quite. She had access to the archives, yes, to the records. But this wasn't merely cataloguing. This was involvement, complicity, perhaps, or something else. I returned to the chapel, not for insight, but for architecture. Sometimes only the weight of stone will keep a thought from slipping away. The candles were still burning near the transept, and I let my eyes rest on them as if they might burn a pattern into the question I hadn't yet shaped. E.R., not just Evangeline Rose. Could it be Edwin Railsey? I remembered the misquoted line, to see instead of to find. I had dismissed it as a philosophical tremor, but perhaps it was a confession in disguise. I walked to the warden's office the next morning, unannounced, unwelcome. He was seated by the fire, the Daily Telegraph folded beside his tea. He said little as I presented the ledger, less when I explained the phantom scholarship. Eventually, he murmured that there had been an incident in 1975. A disciplinary matter. The college had chosen to handle it internally. That reputation had been at stake. I asked if Dents had been forced out. He said nothing. I asked if Railsey had benefited. He looked away. I left him there, by the fire, not because I pitied him, but because men who look away already know what they've seen. That night I sat again with the crossword. The same clue stared up at me. Consequence of concealment. 8 letters. This time I tried injustice. It didn't fit, not by a single square, but it lingered. As I closed the book, I noticed something odd. A slip of paper caught between the final pages. Not part of the puzzle. A torn edge, yellowing. Stratham's handwriting, barely legible. One of us suffered. One succeeded. One stayed silent. 3 men. 1 lie. And a balance sheet that never quite balanced, no matter how neatly the numbers aligned. She was already there when I arrived. Sitting at the far end of the library's upper reading room, motionless except for one hand that rested on a closed volume as though she hadn't decided whether to open it or bury it. Her cardigan was the same pale grey she always wore, a colour chosen, I suspect, not out of indifference, but as a form of quiet resistance, the kind of shade that neither absorbs nor reflects too much. Evangeline Rose did not turn when I stepped in, though the door, always sticky on damp days, gave its usual sigh as it opened. I stood a moment longer than necessary, watching her through the bookshelves the way you might watch a piece of music if it refused to begin. When I spoke her name, she didn't start, just closed the book entirely and turned its spine up. Said she had expected me, that everything now was winding inwards, that she had been listening for the steps. I sat opposite her. The table between us was worn smooth by decades of elbows and annotation, and I found myself tracing one of the deeper grooves with my finger. It was, I realized, roughly the length of a sentence. She asked if I had found the letter, the one Stratham wrote but never posted. I nodded. She said she hadn't read it. She didn't need to. She had known its contents long before he wrote it, that he had loved precision more than forgiveness. That, for some men, regret is an abstract luxury they only allow themselves when it can no longer serve anyone. I asked her if she had ever seen the name Linscombe before. She didn't answer, not right away. Then she said it slowly, like a language half-remembered. Said it wasn't a name, but a cipher. That it had belonged to no student, no alumnus. That it had been used once, long ago, on a draft report, just as a placeholder. One of those harmless inventions people make in systems that feel too complex to complete without fiction, and yet the fiction had been paid. Twice. Once in 1975, once again, last term. She turned to the window then, but didn't face it. Just tilted her chair slightly, enough to cast her profile in the grey afternoon light. She said the grant had been signed because she had signed it. Not because she understood it, but because she trusted him. Stratham. And because she thought that by assisting his concealments, she might help him carry the weight he refused to share. I said that was a dangerous kind of faith. She said it was the only kind worth having. The room had grown darker. Outside, the rain had begun again. Not the heavy rain of punishment, but the gentle, persistent kind that erodes over time. I thought of the garden bench, the cigarette stub, the gate. I asked if she had been there that night. She said no, but that she knew who had. I asked her why she hadn't come forward. She asked me what it would change. Silence returned. It was not an empty silence. It was full of implication, of decisions made long before I'd been called into this, of loyalties worn thin. She opened the drawer beside her, removed a thin folder and slid it across the table. Inside were pages from a fellowship application dated 1975, a cover letter in Railsey's hand, a recommendation from Dent's, and one page is missing, a summary page, a note in Stratham's writing on the last leaf. Appointment advanced. Originals filed elsewhere. Filed where? I asked. She turned back toward the window. The original copy, she said, had gone missing after a faculty vote. She hadn't seen it since. Only the echoes, in budgets, in archive labels, in whispers carried along corridor stone. I took the file and left without asking her what she meant to do. Some women bear their grief not like wounds, but like inscriptions carved long before the stone was set in place. Back in my rooms, the crossword waited. Consequence of concealment. 8 letters. This time I didn't try to solve it. Just underlined the clue, folded the page, and watched as the light on the window glass turned the word into shadow. There is a particular kind of mist that only seems to belong to Oxford. Not fog in the usual sense, not the thick blanketing curtain that swallows cities whole, but something thinner, more deliberate. It clings to the shoulders of statues, slips between the arms of cloisters, drapes itself over spires with a lover's reluctance. It obscures nothing entirely, but it allows doubt to breathe. It was under that kind of veil that I walked to Railsey's rooms, sometime after dusk. Not summoned, not expected. I don't believe he would have opened the door if he'd seen me approach. But he did. He was seated at the edge of the hearth, firelight flinching across his face. He said nothing at first, just gestured to the armchair across from him and poured a second glass of something that wasn't sherry this time. I asked him if he remembered the name Linscombe. Hadda, he said he did. Said it with too much stillness, like a bell rung without sound. Then, almost thoughtfully, he asked whether I believed a man should be judged by the ambitions of his youth. I said youth was never the problem. It was what people did in its name. He looked at me for a long time then. The fire crackled once, like punctuation. He told me Stratham had discovered the entry weeks ago, the scholarship payment from 1975, that he had come to Railsey with the ledger, with questions, with that calm, grave disappointment that, coming from a man like Stratham, stung more than accusation. He hadn't intended to harm anyone, Railsey said. He'd merely tried to preserve the future he thought he was owed. Dentz's manuscript, the one in question, had been fragmented, uncertain in origin. He claimed Stratham had encouraged him to tidy it, to borrow, then later denied it. I asked him if he thought Stratham meant to go public. He said he didn't know. But the fact that the letter hadn't been posted suggested hesitation, and yet hesitation too has consequences. He said he hadn't meant to confront him, only to talk, to persuade, to explain that revealing the truth would do more harm than good, not just to himself, but to the college. He said the argument had taken place in the garden, that Stratham had insisted on meeting there beneath the copper beech, that something had broken between them, not violently, not all at once, but like glass under slow pressure. There had been shouting, words neither man would ever unsay, and then a step backwards, a stumble, not a push, he said. Never that, just a fall. Into the river path behind the garden wall, a shallow drop, but Stratham had struck his head. Gone still too quickly, he didn't say what happened next. But I already knew. The bicycle was placed by the chapel gate. The window was propped open to let the night air fill the scent of presents. The letter left behind was carefully addressed, but never sealed. Railsey said he waited with him. For a long time. That he couldn't leave until the body had stopped resembling a person he had once admired. I asked him why he hadn't come forward. He said he had once told a student, long before the matter with Dents, that poetry was how civilized people confess what they cannot survive admitting. This, he said, was his poetry. He poured himself another drink but did not raise it. The fire had gone low, and the mist was now pressing against the tall windows, diffusing the glow into something almost sacred. I rose. He didn't ask what I would do. He only asked whether I would ever finish the crossword. I said I didn't think so. Back in my room, I sat in the dim with the clue open before me. Consequence of concealment, 8 letters. I picked up my pen, wrote exposure, then crossed it out, and wrote nothing else. The crossword was still where I'd left it, folded once and slid beneath a book of Purcell scores I hadn't touched in weeks. The paper had softened at the creases, the ink slightly blurred along the margin, as though even its defiance was beginning to fade. I set it out in front of me with the reverence one gives to unsent letters and unplayed records. The fire was dying, but I didn't add to it. Some kinds of light belong to endings. Consequence of concealment, 8 letters. I'd filled it 6 ways by now. Regret, exposure, remainder, injustice. Each is too small or too much. I had written them in and struck them out, as though the act itself might summon the answer, the way one sometimes circles a building twice before knocking on the right door. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The gutters ran with the last of it, a kind of sighing sound, like someone walking away without shoes. I thought of Railsey and the way he had said it. Not with guilt, not even with self-pity, but with something quieter. A man who has lived too long with a truth too soft to sharpen into confession, and of Stratham, precise to the end. His final gesture was not theatrical, not heroic, just measured. Even the bicycle, left by the chapel, not discarded but placed. I imagined the note on his desk, the one to E.R., written without urgency, folded without haste. He had known what was coming, or decided. Evangeline Rose had said nothing more after our last meeting. She didn't need to. There are women who know how to close a door without sound. And Dents, the man who vanished politely, the third in the photograph, the one whose departure was never grieved, only filed, a name remembered only when it was convenient to forget him. 3 men, 1 silence. I thought briefly of taking the matter to Strange, filing the appropriate forms, writing the summary. I imagined his voice on the line, dry, worn, half-choked by bureaucracy, and I knew what he would say, that if no crime could be proved, then no crime remained, that some things, once buried by enough old paper and old men, were best left to soften in the ground. I poured the last of the whiskey, let it settle, and then, without deciding to, I picked up the pen. 8 letters. Reckoning, I wrote it slowly, one letter per square. R-E-C-K-O-N-I-N-G, too many. I looked again, counted again. No mistake. The word had grown in my head, swollen with meaning, but it was one letter too full. And so I crossed it out. The fire had dwindled to its barest bones now, a glow more memory than flame. I reached for the matchbox and thought better of it. Instead, I folded the crossword once more, this time along a new crease, placed it back beneath the Purcell, closed the lid of the piano. Some puzzles resist completion not because they are unsolvable, but because the solving would cost more than the mystery is worth. I sat back, let the silence gather, and somewhere between the tick of the clock and the groan of the old floorboards settling above me, I heard it, the faint, almost imperceptible clang of a bicycle bell. Imagined, perhaps, or not. I didn't rise. Some answers are meant to be left just shy of the final square,